Welcome to Mind Garden. As you saw that I posted earlier, we're going to hear about the controversial history of comic books from Michael. And then we're going to hear from Matt. You know, like I said, dude, where's my code? But he had a different title that maybe he didn't want to be so duty about it. So anyway, Michael, go ahead.
Duty.
All right, yeah. So for those who don't know, I'm pretty into comic books, and over the last year or so, I've learned a lot about the history. And there's both good and bad in the history. There's a lot of history of, just what different things came out and how the industry changed. This is more or less the story of creators' rights is a lot of the focus, as well as just kind of general trends within the industry that were positive, negative, in between. I'll kind of go from there. So we'll start in the 30s. In my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, on a hot summer night, there were two kids that were having a sleepover. And in the middle of this hot night, they can't sleep. They have this stroke of genius where they talk about this man who could leap tall buildings in a single bound or run faster than a train and repel bullets. A few years later, in 1938, they were able to sell that to the company that became DC Comics, and that was published as Action Comics #1. So 10 cents then, it's about 3 million or so now, if you want to get it, even if it's just a little snippet of it. But they sold
3 million or billion?
Million.
Okay.
Billion, that would be a little excessive.
Oh, just 3 million.
Yeah, it's not bad. So they sold their idea, and they sold their work for $130, which was pretty good, a decent pay rate at the time, but we will definitely discuss that in a little bit. The next year, Detective Comics #27 comes out with this crazy character, the Batman, who was created by Bob Kane, and we will revisit that eventually as well. We move on, time goes on, the 40s come up, and we have Captain America #1 that comes out from the company that becomes Marvel Comics. This is Joe Simon and Jack Kirby made Captain America. And we can see it like right on the cover. It's literally Captain America punching Hitler in the face. This is a year before Pearl Harbor. This is well before America even gets into the war, or that a lot of people cared about it personally. So this is one of the first this is the first instance where we can see comics having this political message that is really strong and helps shape public opinion. During the 40s, Simon and Schuster, who created Superman, they decide that their creation was worth more than the $130 that they got paid for it. So they go back and they try to sue for the copyright for Action Comics 1 and for Superman. They lose. The judge basically says, you got $130, you did 13 pages of work, you got $10 a page, and you were just selling the work that you did. It's fine. That's it. That's all we're doing. So the judge said they didn't have any extra right to it, and that sets a very dangerous precedent that continues on even to today. Moving on to the 50s. So the war happens. Comics sell like hotcakes during the war. There's a lot of wartime type propaganda-ish comics, such as Captain America, that are easy to get and inspire the troops and whatnot. And when the war ends, people don't really know what to do with these comics. So basically DC and Marvel just tried to keep going with the same concepts. So during the 50s, Captain America was punching communists instead of Nazis, basically. And they just tried to keep the same tone, keep it going exactly the same as it had before. It turns out that didn't really work. Sales took a dip in the 50s, and they started to come back up. And then this happened. Frederick Wortham was a doctor who wrote this book, Seduction of the Innocent, which sounds very scary and very not good. And that's exactly the concept that he was trying to present. essentially what he did is he went and interviewed a whole bunch of people in jail and said, what do you read? And they're all like, comic books, man. And he's like, that's it. That's what caused it. Comics are necessarily bad for society. They cause crime. And he goes on this huge campaign that, I mean, it seems dumb now. Like, we could easily point and say, like, why would you say that, like, comic books would cause crime? But it was such a big deal, like the Supreme...
Everyone knows it's video games.
Yeah, everyone knows. It was so big that there's even like he and the comics companies were brought before the Senate to testify about it. And his, mantra is always, comics are bad, comics are bad. And the comics industry really didn't have anything to say. I mean, there were comics that were lewd, there were comics that were violent in different ways. And so they tried their best to say, this is a creative enterprise, we're just doing something creative and there's nothing that causes crime. But that wasn't enough for the public. So for the public, what the comics did is they established the Comics Code Authority, which was basically their self-appointed governance, their own censorship, like third party, to go through and say you can or cannot publish these things. And they made these essentially articles of what we will allow or won't allow. And here are just a couple of odd ones, like you cannot have horror or terror in your title. Like you could have it as a theme, but it can't be in the title. You have to show police in a positive light, and you have to show that crime necessarily is bad and leads to bad consequences. You can't have vampires or werewolves, and you can't have anything obscene or vulgar. Like, some of these things, it may make sense as like, you think as like a 50s parent, like, yeah, I don't want, my child reading comics with vulgar, crime-ridden werewolves in terror.
Zombies are okay.
They might have been.
At the time. They didn't know about them yet.
They didn't know. So it was a lot of just kind of random things like that. There's one funny instance that I found where there's a very famous comic writer named Marv Wolfman. And so he was writing a comic, I don't remember if it was in the 50s or later, but it was this kind of mystery, whatever comic. And they say it's like a little tagline, it's as told by a wandering wolf man, because his name is Wolfman. The Comics Code Authority reaches out and says, you can't publish this has a wolf man, and that's bad. And they're like, but it's his name, his name is Wolfman. So there are a lot of just kind of random things like that where the Comics Code just kind of willy-nilly nixed things without really any good reason for it.
But this authority was put together by the comics industry, right?
Yeah, it was put together by the industry as an attempt to shore up their reputation and have people trust them as an industry. But over the decades, it was honestly very detrimental to the industry, having so many different things that were kind of stamped out. As far as I'm aware, there were attempts to have more inclusion, including racially or sexually, or a lot of different things. And the Comics Code said, nope, that's too risky. We're not doing anything like that. As far as I heard the Comics Code Authority repeatedly saying, you can't have this black superhero that you want. I don't know for sure, I've just heard that from some sources, but things like that where the Comics Code was just really, really damaging to the industry. Moving on to the 60s.
Isn't the 50s when they started doing the movies for too, that basically did the same thing for the movie industry? Yeah, before the actual ratings, but they did have a board and a code that was governing what you could show in a movie and what you couldn't show in a movie.
That would make sense. So in the 60s, Marvel Comics became really, really big. Starting with Fantastic Four #1, written by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. This team goes on to create a lot of things. I kind of like this comparison. So this is the Stan Lee that a lot of us might recognize from Marvel movies or different things. He looked very different in the 60s. He talked normally. He didn't have sunglasses or a mustache or anything. It took him years to develop this persona.
That's what comes.
Stan Lee.
He also got some hair plugs. You could tell his hairline looks different.
Yep.
Some, keep that up.
Yeah, he's an interesting character.
Did you say that Jack Kirby was one of the ones who wrote Captain America too?
Yes, yeah. So Jack Kirby, one of the original things he did was work with Joe Simon to create Captain America. Kirby and Lee together made at least these heroes and all of their villains and any other number of heroes or different things. Like the extent of this two-person team is immeasurable. Like Stan Lee became the editor-in-chief for Marvel, and what he told every single artist that came in was, "Hey, it's not Kirby enough for me," and he would just demand that everything look exactly like Jack Kirby's artwork, which is fine. I mean, Kirby's artwork is great, but in a way it kind of stifled some creativity, I would suspect, and that mindset didn't go away, I think, until later 60s, the 70s. There was a really tripped out Nick Fury comic in the 60s that was like super psychedelic and crazy, and that was kind of the only one that wasn't very Kirby-esque. Stan Lee also worked with a guy named Steve Ditko to create some dumb teenage character named the Spider-Man, who literally the only reason Marvel published Spider-Man was Amazing Fantasy. This is Amazing Fantasy 15. This was the last issue of that comic, and they knew it was the last issue. So they're like, sure, I don't care, put the Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy and we'll call it a day. They started getting in letters constantly, we want to see more Spider-Man, more Spider-Man. So he got his own series, which has continued to today. I think they just hit 900 issues for Spider-Man, for the Amazing Spider-Man specifically. Steve Ditko is the artist on this. Kind of a fun note, Steve Ditko is a very interesting guy. He's very foundationalist, he's very into Ayn Rand, and he hated Stan Lee with a passion. Stan Lee's whole concept was, well, I'll get more into his concept later because we learned about it more after the fact, but he hated working with Lee. And after about 30 issues of Spider-Man, he said, "I'm done, I'm out," and he went on to other greater adventures for himself. Moving on to the 70s. So the first time that we have big challenges to the Comics Code Authority is when I believe the Department of Health reached out to the comics industry and said, "We want you to teach about the dangers of drugs." Well, they tried to do that, but then the Comics Code said, "You can't do that. We don't want to talk about drugs or things that are at all risky or not okay." So what Stan Lee did is he said, well, what if we just publish a couple issues without the Comics Code Authority stamp? And they did that. And we got things like this. It's like crazy 70s. It's like crazy colors and definitely a very particular view on drug use and how it affects the mind. This is Harry Osborn. So Spider-Man's longtime friend, just for this 3-issue arc, they say that he has this drug addiction, and we see how it affects Peter Parker and Mary Jane and his dad even, who, if you didn't know, his dad is Green Goblin, so he does have feelings a little bit, I guess. So it was very kind of...
His dad was Green Goblin?
Yes.
Spoiler!
So it was this very heavy-handed, but again, kind of this political message that, it was important enough to them that they went without the Comics Code Authority stamp of approval. Once that worked out, they saw that, hey, sales didn't plummet and things didn't collapse. They didn't stop doing the Comics Code Authority or anything, but DC did have the courage to go ahead and do their own version with Green Lantern and Green Arrow. This is by a couple really famous creators named Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams, where Green Arrow's young ward, Speedy, turns out to be a junkie, which I think is kind of hilarious. Like, shouldn't we have suspected that Speedy was a junkie?
He was on something, right?
He was definitely on something. Like, I think we should have known this for years, but that's kind of beside the point. This is honestly one of the most famous comic covers, like single comic issues, of just this horrifying realization for Green Arrow of just like, I didn't even know, I'm off fighting crime, I'm off doing these different things, but I didn't know that, someone so close to me was going through such a difficult time. It kind of blew up, and this was kind of the start of people, going around the Comics Code or the Comics Code saying, okay, maybe we need to adjust a little bit. Don't expect much for a while, but they started to at least consider that, hey, that isn't the only possible thing out there. We also have the return of Simon & Schuster, who again in the 70s sue for ownership of Superman in Action Comics 1, and again they lose. They make really strong arguments. The judge essentially says, I see what you mean, and you didn't know exactly what you were selling off, but you sold it. We don't really care. And they kind of moved on. The comics industry at that point, people that were in the industry, took great offense at this, saying hey, they need to have some justice. And so there was a campaign kind of saying, let's, DC Comics do something for them. So in an attempt to kind of appease or acquiesce, DC Comics ended up eventually giving them a substantial payout and said, we'll give you health insurance. Looking at that, I thought, okay, well, maybe that's kind of doing the right thing. It isn't really. It's kind of too little too late. It didn't last. And it didn't really mean very much. They still didn't have rights to the character. They just got essentially this large payment of hush money to say, please stop suing us. We don't want to do this every 30 years. Spoiler alert, they did. Also in the 70s, I got rid of this slide back because I have a couple minutes. There was also a guy named Chris Claremont who was working at Marvel. And there was a little known series that kind of died out. It had been created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, but stopped selling, so they stopped it. And eventually it published another issue that redid the team, and then Chris Claremont took it on and did the X-Men. And he proceeded to write the X-Men for essentially 20 years of writing X-Men, Wolverine, New Mutants, anything that connected to mutants in Marvel Comics. He was the person that did it. And his comics are still praised today as some of the top amazing storytelling that exists in comics. So he got his start in the 70s as well. Moving on to the 80s, I don't have as much controversy about the 80s, although the 80s in and of itself kind of bred a lot of comics controversy. The 80s marked a huge change for comics, and what happened in the 80s is everything went kind of dark and kind of gritty, and that's where we get The Dark Knight Rises by Frank Miller, which didn't really inspire the movie, but it's the same kind of thing where it's this dark and gritty old Batman who comes out of retirement and beats the ever-living tar out of people. It's pretty dark, it's kind of weird, but there are a lot of instances like that. This guy in particular, his name is Alan Moore. He's one of my favorite writers. He's a British guy who got a start in British comics and then went to DC. He wrote a lot of things that I wasn't aware of, such as V for Vendetta, Watchmen, Hero, Batman the Killing Joke, which inspired the Dark Knight film. He wrote a lot of different things, Saga of the Swamp Thing, Miracle Man. Pretty much everything I've read of his I think is really, really fascinating. His work was a lot of that kind of darkness and fear of nuclear holocaust and things like that. Watchmen is a great, great example of his work. I don't recommend that people read that without having read other comics. But it's him deconstructing like what is, the comics industry. And, everyone idolizes this, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, early Superman era. But what does that really mean? And if it were real, he shows like these are real people with real problems, and that would be like horrifying to have this like group of people that have no like oversight or anything like that. And it's a really fascinating kind of breakdown of what the comics industry is. So I love Alan Moore. The 80s, they don't have much controversy other than comics, like the tone just got like way darker. Like it went from this like, there's a monster of the month or something, and they go on some little short adventure to, there's a really great series where Spider-Man is buried alive, and the person that does it pretends to be Spider-Man, and we see how he's just absolutely insane, and how like this is all some weird power trip to him. Like there are a lot of things like that where it's just like the tone is just vastly different from before. Moving on to the 90s, I got rid of another slide, but Spider-Man in the 90s was a rough time. They did something called the clone conspiracy, where Spider-Man had a clone made back in the 70s actually, and then he came back, and then for literally like 10 or 20 years they just had this like confusing mess of like, who's the real Peter Parker, and like who's this other person, and why are there not like 20 million Peter Parker clones, and who's the real one, and it got so complicated. The slide I had that I got rid of for time was literally a comic that Marvel published in '97 that said like 101 ways to end the clone saga, written by like some of their main editors, because they're like, no one can do this, this is literally awful. And a lot of people actually still have problems with Spider-Man because of it. The other interesting thing to come out of the 90s is the Image comics. And there is a documentary called The Image Revolution that I haven't watched, but probably good, where a bunch of people that worked at Marvel Comics especially, and they had proposed different ideas for directions to take characters or different things, and Marvel essentially said, no, we're not doing that. Like, these are the characters, work with them their normal way, and don't stray from the path, kind of a thing. Well, they got really mad with that, and that they didn't have the creative outlet that they wanted, as well as everything that a comics creator would make would be the property of the company. And we saw that, over and over again with Superman, that it is the property of DC Comics, and Simon & Schuster have no right to it. But what this group of people said is, we want to form a company where all of the rights go to the creators. We just take a portion of the profits for publishing it, but we want everything to be the right of the creator. So they made Image Comics, which is like, today in terms of comic sales, there's still Marvel and DC at the top, but Image is right next to them. Often people refer to the big two of Marvel and DC. Now I see a lot of people start to refer to the big three, because Image is huge now too. And it really kind of rocked the industry. People thought like, is this going to ruin Marvel or DC? Didn't, but it's fine. And there was a lot of talk of what does this mean. As well in the 90s, there was also a large comic bubble, like the Beanie Babies and things like that. And so there are some really big things that happened in the 90s that they thought would be like these huge collector's items, but now they're kind of worthless because there are like 12 million copies in existence. And so kind of pointless.
What's Image's most recognizable creation?
The Walking Dead was originally an Image comic. So yeah, maybe I should talk about Robert Kirkman when we get over here to the 2000s. Robert Kirkman is probably the wealthiest man in comics. People always say you don't go into comics for the money, because that's definitely true. Like it's not that great unless you have something big. Robert Kirkman is like filthy rich, because he invented the Walking Dead and worked on the TV show. He had the rights to it. He also made Invincible, which was just made into an animated show. Like, he's got a bunch of stuff that, and now he's the CEO, as I recall, of Image Comics. So he did very well for himself. The 2000s, I don't have that much to say other than the Comics Code Authority. People finally were like, do we even really need that anymore? And they stopped publishing with the little seal on it, and the industry didn't implode, so they're like, okay, well, let's kind of stop, because they're kind of ineffective and unhelpful, and so let's just not deal with that anymore. So today you don't see any Comics Code Authority stamps on pretty much anything. And the other big thing to come out of the 2000s is the MCU started. The MCU, you can have whatever opinion or lack thereof that you want. And I mean, I have plenty of my own opinions. But I want to talk less about the MCU and what it is, and more about what it's meant for the creators. For example,
So
there's
just to define MCU, is that the movie franchise?
yes, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So all the Marvel movies together is the MCU. So for example, there's a Captain America movie where we see the Winter Soldier has a vibranium arm and he's whacked out and stuff. That character was created in the comics, I think, maybe 15 years prior or something. And it was made by a guy named Ed Brubaker, if I remember right. Ed Brubaker didn't receive pretty much any payout for that movie, even though it was his character that he came up with, because he made that character and put it in Marvel Comics under the Marvel Comics label, and he has literally no rights to the character. And that's honestly been the story throughout pretty much all of the Marvel and DC movies, is that often what will happen is maybe the comics companies will send out a thank you check of however much, but there's no real commission or rights or royalties or anything like that. And that's been a huge issue with comics creators saying what am I gonna do? What are we gonna do about this? Because so many, pretty much all of the Marvel movies, you can point back to a particular comic series that it's pulling from, or a handful of them. But those creators that made those aren't typically getting paid for that. The one exception is the exception that I'm hoping is becoming the rule is I saw with the new Thor that the person that made Gore the God Butcher and all of that in his series, that writer was included as a creative consultant on a movie or something. So hopefully he got a good payday. We're really hoping that things like that continue, because it's honestly been a huge issue, because these creators could be making a lot of money. On the 2010s, we learned a lot about the history of comics. So I'll move into this one in just a second. I'll stay on this for now. One controversy that came out was learning about Stan Lee's process more. Stan Lee, what he essentially wanted to do, he was always credited as the writer on all these comics, and it's technically true, but essentially the process that he would do is he would maybe talk with Jack Kirby, here's what we want to do with the Fantastic Four, and then Jack Kirby would say, okay, cool, let's do that. He would draw out an entire issue, and the only thing he would leave out would be the word balloons. And then he would turn it into Stan Lee, and Stan Lee would just fill in dialogue. So realistically, a lot of the time, Stan Lee didn't write any of the story per se. He just kind of filled in the blank and made it kind of sound good. And Kirby took a lot of offense to that. He wanted more credit, saying, you know, I'm the one actually creating most of these stories, like, why am I just the artist on this? And he ended up leaving Marvel Comics during the 60s because he got really upset with Stan Lee, saying, you know, you're not giving me the credit that I deserve. And we didn't really know much about that process until more recently. Another example of that is this man. This is a guy named Bill Finger. Until recently, we didn't know anything about Bill Finger. And in fact, these are some of the only pictures in existence of Bill Finger. Bill Finger co-created Batman. But for about 80 years, the only name that anybody knew was Bob Kane. Bob Kane created Batman, and he sold it to DC Comics, and then he wrote it for a while and was the artist and all this. What we learned more recently is Bob Kane was more or less a charlatan. Like, he was more or less a contractor, and he ran his own studio, where he would say, you know, write a story or do the art, and then he would take that, aggregate it, and turn it into DC Comics. He would get paid out, and then he would pay his staff. There's even a funny time where he turned in an issue to DC Comics, and the editor was like, oh, we need you to redo this panel that you did, kind of chuckling, knowing that Bob Kane didn't really do it. And Bob Kane is like, oh, sure, let me take it back to my drawing board at my house, kind of thing. I mean, he's like, no, we have plenty here, like, you can just go do it. And he's like, okay. And he goes and sits down, and apparently sits down for like 10 or 20 minutes, doesn't do anything, and then turns to the guy next to him and says, hey, I'll give you $20 if you redo this panel for me. And like, he literally did that essentially his entire career. And he did come up with the idea of Batman, but his original Batman was in a red costume with these weird wings that were controlled by ropes, and he had a little diamond mask, and it was not at all what we know. Bill Finger came up with the costume, some of the backstory he helped write for a while, so a lot of the credit for Batman should go to Bill Finger, and it didn't for a long time until there was a book and a documentary and a lot of things that came out about him. And finally, for the first time in about 80 years, he got credit with Batman v Superman. He was listed as a co-creator.
Question?
Yes.
So what happened to the guy that Stan Lee, you said he left Marvel? Kirby?
Yeah, Kirby went on to, his is also a little bit of a sad story. He went on and kind of tried to do his own thing, and he had a lot of ideas. He ended up going to DC Comics and trying to do a lot of those ideas. They just didn't take very well. And he did end up begrudgingly going back to Marvel at one point, which I'm sure felt odd. And again, he tried a lot of his different ideas. They were very cosmic ideas, such as like the Eternals. And they just didn't tend to take very well. His art is still praised as some of the best art in comics history, but his is a little bit sad too. To return to Bill Finger for just a second, because he didn't get credit during his lifetime, he died basically alone and poor, and like it was only like 30 years after his death that like one guy went on like a crusade to find out about him. He found these pictures. He found out that Bill Finger had a son who had also died, and then he found out there was a granddaughter, and he worked with the granddaughter to sue DC Comics for credit, and that's when they were eventually able to get credit listing that now exists in all the comics and movies today. So it was kind of sad, but worked out.
Do you get paid if you're a mentor?
I think the granddaughter does get paid some, would be my guess. A similar thing happened with Joe Siegel's descendants. He was one of the creators of Superman, and his descendants later sued, I think, in the 2000s or 2010s, and then also got some rights to now Superman comics say like, you know, with express permission of the Siegel family, and different things like that. So to just kind of wrap up today, the things that are biggest that we're grappling with is dealing with, you know, the creator rights, when they're working for a company. There's, you know, people will always work for the company, and that's why Marvel and DC haven't given any rights, is because people go into comics for the love of it, and they're not worried as much about the money, so they want to write for Spider-Man or Batman. But then later, there's all those rights issues. So we need to deal with that, and need to kind of work through. There's a lot of talk about politics and different things like that in comics. But essentially, my ending spiel is just that comics are a medium, and they're not superheroes. There's all sorts of different things, and I found a huge variety that I didn't know existed, and a lot of comics that have gone on to inspire other things like shows and movies or different things. And it's kind of a challenge to me. If you are interested in trying something, tell me what shows or movies or books you're into, and I bet I could find you a comic that's interesting too. So, and that's it. The very